Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm Benji Strauss. I'm the CEO of CardiMetrix, and my team is focused on reducing hospital readmissions for heart failure, which is by far one of the most severe public health burdens in the U.S. today, at a clip of approximately $17 billion. And before I tell you about the particular technology that we've developed, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who we are and how we got there. When I was a senior at Cooper Union's engineering school, I put together a team of some classmates, other engineers, as well as cardiologists, with the goal of developing some systems that could better monitor heart failure patients at home, with the thesis that if we could better monitor them at home, we could better intervene and provide treatments potentially earlier before a heart failure readmission was necessary. And we raised a seed round of capital with the best angels around and developed a system that could monitor 9 different advanced heart failure biometrics in a single device, really simple to use, with the idea that this would maximize patient compliance in the home. And from there, we got commitments from the best heart failure experts in the country to run studies on this. But one of the motifs that kept coming up over and over again was monitoring peripheral edema. And we thought long and hard about how we might be able to do that. And ultimately, that led us to think about developing an independent system for doing that. So now let's talk about exactly what the problem is. Well, the problem is that measuring or monitoring peripheral edema in heart failure patients is one of the absolute best methods of determining health status in heart failure patients and the efficacy of drugs like, say, patients' diuretics. However, the problem is that the way that we monitor for peripheral edema or swelling in the legs in patients, both in the hospital as well as patients in the home, is woefully inaccurate and insufficient. And so we're really left with a poor frame of reference for when these patients are retaining fluid. So for patients in the hospital, the way that we would usually monitor them would be having a patient care associate or a nurse examine the legs just visually and score edema on, say, a scale of 0 or 1 to 3, et cetera, for no edema through pretty severe edema. However, there's obviously inter-user variations from that, and not particularly descriptive or reliable. And at the other end of the spectrum, for patients who are in the home, what's usually asked of them is to measure their weight on a daily basis, and we try to correlate significant weight increase with fluid retention, although that really also hasn't proven to be particularly reliable, seeing as that we have about 1 million hospital readmissions a year. And so in either of these cases, say for hospital use, what this unreliable method leads to most often is discharge of patients that are too early. And again, for patients in the home, that leads to really poor management of diuretics. And both of those lead to hospital readmissions, again, at a clip of about 1 million a year and at a cost of $17 billion. So what have we done to solve this? We've designed a solution that is extremely accurate and non-variable. We can call this the Edema Sock. And the device is placed on the foot, turned on like this. I don't know if you can see it, but this automatically transmits to a smartphone that can then relay it to a cloud. And the idea is that doing this can give a highly reliable and objective reading of edema severity as well as diuretic effectiveness in heart failure patients. As far as the details of how this works, we have a novel and proprietary method to measure the daily changes in the foot volume, and by doing that we can determine the extent of peripheral edema. As I mentioned before, we have an embedded Bluetooth modem that transmits the results to a smartphone. We relay that to the cloud, where the patient's care provider can, say, periodically analyze those trends and determine if the patient is deviating from the baseline or deteriorating. And by doing that, the patient's care provider might be able to intervene and, say, adjust a dose of diuretic. As far as competition, there are other solutions out there, ranging from advanced to more simple ones. Solutions on the left, such as Honeywell's home ed monitor comprise a series of different monitoring systems to determine if there might be more fluid. So say a bathroom scale and a blood pressure monitor, et cetera, maybe a pulse ox. The problem is that they comprise maybe 4 or 5 different moving parts and become really, really cumbersome for patients to use. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have simpler systems such as measuring water volume or measuring ankle volume by water displacement. But not only is there a high level of variability, but it was found that in patients who didn't have carpeted bathrooms, when water would spill, they were at a higher risk of falling. And so patients would go back to the hospital, not just with heart failure problems, but also with fractured hips. And so that's therefore fallen out of favor. And so we think that we have a nice value proposition to change there. As far as commercializing this, how do we get this into the system? Well, the way we'd like to approach this is provide these socks for, say, integrated delivery networks, large hospital systems such as Mount Sinai, and prescribe this to patients upon entering the hospital for a heart failure issue, and monitoring it through them having a patient care attendant or a nurse put this on the patient once a day, and in doing so not just acquire these metrics but also train patients so that when they go home they can also do the same thing, rinse and repeat on a daily basis to monitor this. And the idea would be that the more we reduce readmissions, the more hospitals' penalties are reduced. And in doing so, we can incentivize hospitals to continue prescribing this for their patients and make them willing to pay for, say, the sock and perhaps a nominal transmission fee and hosting and data analysis fee. As far as the target market, there are currently approximately 6 million heart failure patients in the U.S., 1 million readmissions a year. And as far as a strategy for moving forward long-term for reimbursement, 4.5 million, or 3 out of every 4 heart failure patients are covered by Medicare, and so that would be the first target for a reimbursement code. As far as progress, we have a functioning prototype right here, U.S. and international patents pending, and we were also awarded a micro grant from the American Heart Association for being one of the top 3 most innovative cardiac startups of 2015. Our next step is to raise $350,000 in additional funding to progress this project. And in doing so, what we would like to use those proceeds for would be to perfect the prototype that we have into additional versions. We think this is a pretty textbook class 1 play for 510K, so there wouldn't be too much cost there as far as filing an exemption. We'd like to execute a pilot study to validate the accuracy of the system and ultimately execute manufacturing distribution partnerships, and subsequent to that, do a pilot commercialization and ultimately a larger study to demonstrate not just accuracy, but to demonstrate improvement in outcomes, reduction in hospitalizations, and reduction in costs for payers. Thank you.